How do we truly become, well-informed? How do we navigate this world that's just bursting with information, constant change? We're often told, seek logical, perfectly explained ideas, define everything clearly.
Right, get it all neat and tidy.
Exactly. But what if that very reliance on such neat explanations is, in fact, a trap?
Huh.
What if the things we try so hard to simplify are actually the ones that make us stronger, more resilient?
Today we're embarking on a profound deep dive into Nassim Nicholas Taleb's seminal work, Antifragile. And this isn't just about surviving chaos, it's about fundamentally understanding how to thrive because of it, how to actually grow stronger from disorder.
Okay.
Our mission for you, the listener, is to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge from the sources you've provided. We want to reveal practical wisdom, shed light on hidden risks, and frankly, challenge some deeply held assumptions about why intuition and pragmatic action often serve us better than pure, unadulterated logic.
Get ready for a truly surprising journey then. We're going to unpack some genuinely thought-provoking ideas. We'll explore this fascinating philosophical clash between an ancient Greek thinker obsessed with definitions.
Socrates?
Socrates, yeah, and a street-smart pragmatist who sees the world through a very different lens. We'll uncover a radical reevaluation of how we assess risk, moving beyond simple probabilities to focus on something far more crucial: consequences.
At the payoff.
And yes, we'll even delve into a controversial yet insightful take on the institution of education itself. This deep dive really promises to shift your perspective on uncertainty.
It certainly should.
Okay, let's unpack this with a core concept from our sources, one that truly redefines what balance means: the barbell strategy. It's not about achieving a conventional, neatly diversified equilibrium where everything is averaged out. It suggests something, well, far more dynamic and frankly kind of counterintuitive to traditional wisdom.
Precisely. The sources describe the conventional idea of balancing out, where you spread your risk thinly across many average options, as belonging to what Taleb calls mediocrism.
Mediocrism.
Yeah, this is a realm where averages are meaningful, where predictable outcomes dominate, and where extreme events are, well, rare and have limited impact. But as the book argues, this kind of conventional balance is often an illusion of routine strategy when you're actually operating in what Taleb terms extremistan.
And what defines extremistan? What makes it different?
Extremistan is where the rules change entirely. Here, rare extreme events, often called black swans, dominate, and their impact is disproportionately massive. Think stock market crashes, huge scientific breakthroughs, global pandemics, that kind of thing.
Okay, big, unpredictable stuff.
Exactly. In such environments, averaging out can actually make you more vulnerable, not less. The barbell strategy, by contrast, is for these extremists, for those who understand they live at least partly in extremistan. It suggests a very specific asymmetric allocation.
Asymmetric, how so?
You make one aspect of your life, a large portion, typically say 80% or 90%, as robust, safe, and utterly conservative as possible. You secure your downside. You make sure you can't be wiped out.
Okay, maximum safety on one side.
Right. Then you intentionally expose a much smaller, typically 10% or 20% portion to potentially infinite upside and extreme volatility, but with a strictly limited downside. It's about being ultra safe at one end and highly speculative or open to opportunity at the other, with virtually nothing in that vulnerable middle ground.
So if I understand correctly, you're not just saying don't put all your eggs in one basket. You're saying put most of your eggs in an unbreakable basket, like 90% of them, and then put the other 10% in a basket that, if it works out, could give you an infinite supply of golden eggs. But if it breaks, well, you only lose those few. That sounds radically different from classic portfolio diversification, for instance.
Exactly. Traditional diversification often aims for a moderate risk across the board, which can leave you surprisingly vulnerable to large, unexpected shocks because everything is kind of correlated in a crisis. The barbell strategy acknowledges that most events don't matter much, but a few can matter immensely, both positively and negatively.
Okay.
Think about how this applies to something like education, for instance, a topic that often draws strong opinions.
Yeah, definitely.
The sources point out that guaranteed education graduation from a formal institution might be a societal expectation, right? It's a baseline of security that provides credentials and a predictable path. This is the safe, conservative part of the barbell, the 90%.
The safe bet.
The safe bet, exactly. But the real upside potential, the truly transformative growth, the stuff that changes your life, often comes from informal learning.
So not necessarily from the structured curriculum, but from the exploration around it, the stuff you do yourself.
Precisely. This informal learning includes things like visiting libraries and truly devouring books, not just skimming. Engaging in deep conversations with genuinely intellectual people, not just networking, constantly listening to audiobooks, watching insightful videos, or intensely following your own curiosities wherever they lead.
Right.
The sources call it anything that opens your mind and broadens your ideas. The formal structures provide that secure foundation, that base knowledge, yes, but true, unbounded intellectual growth often comes from that open-ended, unpredictable, self-directed exploration. It's that unscripted, non-linear engagement with knowledge that holds the real unpredictable gains, the potentially infinite upside, the 10%.
That makes so much sense. It's about opening yourself up to serendipity, isn't it? To those unexpected opportunities that you couldn't possibly plan for. It sounds almost like the idea of optionality, the right to gain without the obligation to lose.
That's a perfect connection, and it's a concept absolutely central to Taleb's work. Optionality is key. Consider the example in the sources of publishing a book. You put in the effort, right? That's your limited downside.
Your time, your energy?
Exactly. But the infinite upside potential you will never know in advance. It might flop completely. Or it might become a massive bestseller, influencing millions and bringing all sorts of unexpected opportunities your way. The downside is capped, but the upside is literally unknowable, potentially huge.
Right, you can't predict that success.
Or even simpler, a seemingly trivial invitation to a party in London, as the sources mention. It's an upside advantageous free mail invitation. You have the right to go to or the right to refuse not to attend. There's absolutely no downside risk if you decline, maybe a missed evening. But if you go, you might meet someone pivotal, discover a new passion, forge a lifelong connection. You can't lose, but you might gain immensely. That's pure optionality.
And this isn't just for intellectual pursuits or social engagements. It applies to physical health, too, in a way that really challenges those conventional, boring gym routines.
Absolutely. The sources use a powerful gym analogy. If your only idea is to do the exact same routine, lifting the exact same weights for the exact same reps every single time, well, your body stops growing stronger, your muscles adapt, your joints get used to it, you hit a plateau.
Been there.
We all have. But if you constantly strive for what the sources call sorum extra next time, meaning just a little bit more, a slight increase in challenge adding 50 gram only, 100 grams only to your list, just a tiny increment, you can achieve infinite advantage at the healthy level.
Just tiny bits more stress.
Tiny bits more, consistently applied. It's about creating a safe, stable base, consistently showing up at the gym, that's the 90%, but within that secure environment, constantly pushing for unbounded nonlinear gains through small, deliberate increases in stress. You're not trying to balance your routine by doing a good of everything moderately. You're securing the base and then pushing the extremes in a controlled, incremental way. That is the essence of anti-fragility in practice, building strength through stress.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and perhaps a bit provocative. Our sources dive into this fascinating thought experiment. What if the ancient Greek philosopher Socrates, famously obsessed with clear definitions, logical clarity, the pursuit of explicit knowledge, what if he debated Fat Tony?
Ah, Fat Tony, the pragmatist.
Exactly. A street-smart, no-nonsense pragmatist who lives by intuitive rules and consequences. It's a clash of two profoundly different ways of knowing, understanding the world, and ultimately living.
This pivotal chapter, aptly titled Fat Tony Debates Socrates, addresses a crucial error that Taleb identifies as the most severe mistake made in life is to mistake the unintelligible for the unintelligent.
Say that again. Mistake the unintelligent.
For the unintelligent, meaning just because you can't understand something or articulate it perfectly in logical terms doesn't mean it's stupid or wrong. This isn't just a minor slip-up, it's a fundamental flaw, a cognitive bias that has plagued intellectual history for centuries. It's a sibling, Taleb says, to mistaking absence of evidence for evidence of absence. The error of assuming something doesn't exist simply because you don't have explicit proof right now.
Right, the old you can't prove it doesn't exist problem.
Exactly. And the sources link this problem directly to philosophy, specifically arguing it has been prevalent since Aristotle, who heavily emphasized categorization and precise definition.
So let's set the stage. What did Socrates represent in this philosophical showdown? What was his core philosophy, his driving intellectual force?
Socrates, as we know him, primarily comes to us through the writings of his students, Plato and Xenophon, since he famously left no writings of his own. He really was the first philosopher in the modern sense because he shifted philosophical inquiry from the natural world to the human condition, focusing intensely on ethics and knowledge.
Like,
He was relentlessly focused on clear, narrated, intelligible knowledge and precise, universal definitions. The sources give a vivid example from Plato's Euthyphro dialogue. Remember that one?
vaguely.
Remind me. Socrates encountered Euthyphro, who was on his way to charge his own father with manslaughter, claiming it was a pious act. Socrates, true to form, kept pestering the poor fellow because Euthyphro couldn't come up with a consistent, clear, universally applicable definition of pity or holiness, even though he claimed to be acting on its very grounds.
Right, he kept asking, what is piety?
Exactly. Socrates believed you couldn't truly act morally or understand anything deeply if you couldn't articulate its essence, its definition. If you can't define it, you don't know it.
He was famous for saying, an unexamined life is not worth living. He truly wanted to question everything, didn't he? To peel back the layers of conventional wisdom right down to the core meaning of concepts. The sources even mentioning cross-examining poets, which I find fascinating.
Oh, yeah, that's telling.
He'd ask them to explain the most elaborate passages, and he apparently found that they often had no more clue than the general public about the true meaning of their own work. They were channeling something, perhaps, but they couldn't articulate it rationally.
Indeed. This priority of definitional knowledge ultimately led to Plato's famous idea of forms, the notion that you cannot truly know anything unless you know its essential, universal definition, its perfect, unchanging form. As the sources put it, you can't get a map from territory, meaning you can't derive perfect theoretical knowledge just by looking at messy, unpredictable reality. But you can build a territory out of map. Meaning, if you have the perfect definition, the ideal form, you can somehow construct or impose reality from it. It's a very top-down, rationalistic, almost engineering-like approach to knowledge. Define first, then act.
But Fat Tony, the practical one, the street-smart operator, saw things very, very differently. How would he have handled Socrates' relentless cross-examination? He wouldn't have played by Socrates' rules, would he? He had pulled a completely different move, I imagine.
Absolutely not. He'd refuse the premise. Fat Tony's power and his profound wisdom lay in never letting others frame the question. He shrewdly taught his protege, Nero, that the answer is planted in every question.
Okay, how so?
Socrates' questions implicitly assumed that explicit definition was the only path to true knowledge. Fat Tony's counter-questions were designed to cut straight to the chase, bypassing Socrates' definitional traps and exposing the absurdity of demanding explicit answers for things known implicitly, things we just do.
Like,
He'd ask things like, does a child need to define mother's milk to understand the need to drink it? Of course not. Or, does a dog need to define what an owner is to be loyal to him? Ridiculous, right?
yeah, completely.
He pushes back hard on the idea that humans are completely stripped off instincts and tacit knowledge, implying that much of what we do effectively, we do intuitively without needing explicit, verbalized definitions or formal logic. It's about successful action, pragmatic outcomes, not perfect articulation. Knowing how versus knowing that.
And Fat Tony's take on why Socrates was ultimately put to death is pretty brutal, isn't it?
Yeah.
He doesn't mince words about the real human consequence of Socrates' relentless questioning. It wasn't just abstract philosophy.
No, it was deeply personal and societal. He tells Socrates in this imagined dialogue in a really searing moment, you know why they are putting you to death. It's because he made people feel stupid for blindly following habits, instincts, and traditions.
Undermining their confidence.
Exactly. Socrates, in Fat Tony's view, was destroying people's illusion about themselves, taking the joy of ignorance out of the things we don't understand, and ultimately offering no answers because, as Fat Tony so powerfully states, life is not a puzzle to be solved, is a mystery to be lived. It's a scathing indictment of intellectual hubris that dismisses non-verbalized wisdom, the wisdom embedded in doing and living.
So in Fat Tony's view, Socrates was basically killing things we can know but can't easily express, like riding a bicycle without needing to know the physics equations. He was confusing people about things they were doing just fine, functioning perfectly well, until Socrates came along and made them doubt their own innate, often unarticulated knowledge and traditions, ultimately disrupting the very fabric of society without offering a viable, practical replacement.
It's a truly powerful point about the dangers of over-rationalization, of thinking we need to explain everything before we can act. Interestingly, though, despite their vastly different approaches to knowledge and life, both men shared some curious traits, according to the sources.
Oh, like what?
Well, they both had time on their hands and enjoyed unlimited leisure, though for Fat Tony, this was the result of successful insights and pragmatic action leading to wealth, while for Socrates, it was more of a lifestyle choice, focusing on philosophy over material gain. Both loved to argue, and both viewed active conversation as a main source of entertainment.
Okay, interesting parallels.
And they even both famously disliked writing. Socrates because he didn't like the definitive and immutable character of the written word for ideas that he believed should be fluid and constantly examined through dialogue. Fat Tony for more practical reasons, having almost flunked out of high school and preferring direct, unmediated interaction over formal
That their
texts.
appearances were quite different, right?
Yeah.
The sources describe Socrates as having a protruding belly, thin limbs, bulging eyes, and snub nose, looking haggard, and even having a bad odor from bathing less, making him physically quite unappealing to many.
I can almost imagine Fat Tony's sneering reaction to such a figure. Right. Though the sources do say Socrates had such a profound intellectual presence that some young men actually found him beautiful despite his physical appearance. It's a fascinating contrast.
That contrast perfectly highlights the difference between a superficial appearance or even conventional wisdom and the presence of profound, challenging thought. The sources also bring in Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, who also launched a vivid, modern attack on Socrates.
Nietzsche had strong views on Socrates.
Yeah, what was his angle?
Nietzsche called him a mystagogue of science, basically a priest or promoter of science for making existence appear incomprehensible by constantly demanding rational explanations for everything, stripping away the intuitive, the instinctual, the mysterious.
And Nietzsche has that potent sentence that truly captures this entire debate, almost serving as the core argument against pure rationalism. What is not intelligible to me is not necessarily unintelligent. Perhaps there is a realm of wisdom from which the logician is exiled. That's a powerful challenge to our everyday assumptions, isn't it?
That sentence is absolutely key to understanding antifragility. It opens the door to recognizing the value of things we can't fully articulate or rationalize. Nietzsche also critiques Socrates' belief that one does not knowingly do evil, an argument that profoundly influenced the Enlightenment's view that truth is always good and that knowledge is inherently beneficial.
Nietzsche questioned that, the goodness of knowledge.
He questioned the very goodness of knowledge itself, suggesting that too much explicit knowledge, too much rationality could actually be detrimental. He saw two fundamental forces at play in ancient Greek culture. The Apollonian, which is measured, rational, self-restrained, ordered, logical,
The Socratic side.
pretty much, and the Dionysian, which is dark, visceral, wild, untamed, chaotic, ecstatic, emerging from our inner instinctual selves. Ancient culture, he argued, balanced these two beautifully, but Socrates' influence, with its excessive emphasis on pure reason, caused an excessive rise of rationalism, disrupting and suppressing the Dionysian. And growth, real growth, according to Nietzsche, cannot proceed without embracing and integrating the Dionysian. You need that chaos, that energy.
And our sources mention that Nietzsche actually coined the term creatively destructive and destructively creative with a direct reference to Dionysius, linking him to the very essence of antifragility. That's a fascinating, almost poetic connection, suggesting that disruption, chaos, when channeled correctly, can lead to new forms of strength and creation.
Indeed, and this anti-rationalistic perspective, this skepticism of explicit knowledge's sole primacy, it has a remarkably long and diverse lineage. It shows it's not just a modern critique from Taleb or Nietzsche. Figures like Cato the Elder, the Roman statesman known for his staunch traditionalism, was apparently highly allergic to Socrates, calling him a mighty babbler who tried to destroy society's customs and traditions through excessive questioning.
So even back then.
Even back then. We also see this thread in Edmund Burke, the Irish statesman who famously countered the French Revolution's radical rationalism, advocating instead for respect for complex heuristics and traditions that had evolved organically over centuries, containing wisdom we might not fully grasp.
All right, wisdom embedded in practice.
Exactly. Michael Oakeshott, a 20th century conservative philosopher, believed that traditions provide an aggregation of filtered collective knowledge, a wisdom distilled over generations that cannot be easily articulated or designed top-down by rational planners. These are all voices that prioritize an accumulated, tacit, evolved wisdom over abstract, rationalistic design.
So it's not just a philosophical debate confined to ancient Greece or modern academia, but a powerful historical thread of thinkers who consistently question the sole primacy of explicit, rationalistic knowledge over other forms of understanding, things like intuition, tradition, or tacit experience gained through doing.
Absolutely. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the influential 20th century philosopher, with his remarkable insights into the inexpressible aspects of language and thought, understood the green lumber issue, that significant gap between theoretical understanding and practical reality. He doubted language's ability to fully express the literal, the practical.
Ah, the green lumber fallacy again. Just remind us quickly.
Sure. It's the story of a trader who successfully traded what he called green lumber because it looked green, making money off its price fluctuations. He didn't know green actually meant freshly cut and therefore heavier due to moisture content. His practical knowledge of market movements trumped his lack of theoretical forestry knowledge. He focused on the actionable attribute, not the definition. Wittgenstein got that.
Okay, got it.
Then there's Friedrich Hayek, the economist famous for opposing central planning, believing instead in distributed or collective intelligence that emerges organically from markets and individual actions. But critically, the sources point out, he kind of missed the notion of optionality as a direct substitute for centralized intelligence. He saw the inefficiency of central planning, but didn't fully grasp the anti-fragile potential of having options, the barbell strategy in action.
Interesting, yeah.
And the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss showed that non-literate peoples had holistic ways of thinking about their environment and the natural world that were not necessarily less coherent or even richer than purely scientific approaches, again, highlighting valuable non-rationalistic forms of knowledge. And finally, the contemporary political philosopher John Gray stands firmly against human hubris, arguing that scientific progress can be a mirage if it leads to overconfidence, and criticizing Enlightenment fundamentalists for treating rationalism as a panacea for all human problems. All these figures, in their own ways, highlight the limits of pure, explicit reason and the dangers of mistaking the unintelligible for the unintelligent.
Okay, so if the Fat Tony versus Socrates debate is fundamentally about these different kinds of knowledge explicit versus intuitive, theoretical versus practical, what does Fat Tony's core distinction, sucker or non-sucker, tell us about how we should actually make decisions in the real world? It sounds less about abstract truth and much more about pragmatic survival and optimizing your personal outcome.
That's exactly it. For Fat Tony and for Taleb, life isn't primarily about true or false, or proving a theory to be correct in some abstract sense. It's about whether you're a sucker or non-sucker in a given situation. The sources emphasize that exposure is more important than knowledge, and that decisions affect supersede logic.
Exposure is more important than knowledge.
Yes, this is a crucial point that intellectual history tragically has horribly missed. We've been far too focused on the accuracy of our models, on the probability of an event happening, and not nearly enough on the consequences of being wrong. The payoff is paramount, meaning what happens to you is always the most important thing, not the event in itself. It's about skin in the game.
So philosophers and scientists might talk about truth and falsehood, about what's demonstrably correct or incorrect in a theoretical sense, but real people in the real world, the ones dealing with the immediate and tangible consequences of their actions. They talk about exposure, fragility, and what they actually stand to gain or lose. It's a profoundly different lens through which to view reality.
Precisely. Truth and falsehood, while important in some contexts, like mathematics, play a poor secondary role in human decisions, when the stakes are high, when there are real consequences. It is the payoff from the true and false that dominates, and this payoff is almost always asymmetric.
Asymmetric. You mentioned that before. What does that mean again?
It means that one consequence, usually the negative one, is often much bigger than the other. You might be right 99% of the time, your predictions might be accurate most of the time, but if the 1% where you're wrong has a catastrophic, irreversible payoff, then your being right most of the time is utterly irrelevant. It doesn't matter how often you're right if being wrong once ruins you.
Give us some powerful, tangible examples from the sources that illustrate this profound asymmetry between probability and payoff. It really helps to ground this abstract idea.
Okay, think about the common, almost mundane practice of checking people for weapons before they board a plane. Security checks. Do we actually believe that any given passenger is likely to be a terrorist?
No, statistically, it's incredibly unlikely.
Exactly. Statistically, empirically, the answer is false. They are not likely. Yet we check them anyway. Every single passenger, every single time. Why? Because we are fragile to terrorism. The payoff of the true, that is, the cost of being wrong, the consequence of missing just one terrorist is too large, and the cost of checking are too low by comparison. The probability is tiny, but the consequence is catastrophic, so the focus shifts entirely to consequence, not probability.
Or consider a nuclear reactor. The probability of it exploding next year is vanishingly small. Yeah.
Infinitesimal. Do you think it's likely to explode next year? False. Yet, we behave as if it were true and spend millions on additional safety measures. Why? Because we're fragile to nuclear events. We don't focus on the incredibly low probability. We focus on the devastating, nonlinear consequence of even a single failure. And this applies to so many everyday decisions. If you were to really jot down all your significant decisions you've made, maybe just in the past week or even over your lifetime, you'd likely realize almost all of them had an asymmetric payoff. And you decide, principally based on fragility, not probability, or not so much based on true or false. This is a fundamental divergence from how many traditional academic decision-making frameworks operate, which often fetishize precise probability calculations over consequence management.
This completely undermines the idea of confidence levels we often hear bandied about in science or statistics. A 95% confidence level sounds perfectly acceptable for a scientific result, in a psychology experiment or something. But what if an airline told you their planes were safe with only 95% confidence, or even 99%? That immediately feels very different, almost terrifying.
The sources highlight this crucial point perfectly. Even a 1% probability of a plane crash would be quite a bit alarming for a commercial flight, despite seeming statistically insignificant in other contexts. Why? Because the cost is so high that you cannot be even once wrong.
Right. Failure's not an option there.
Exactly. It brings up the analogy used in the sources of a manager who rode a bike for 15 years without a helmet. He was 100% right in his observation that nothing bad had happened so far. His prediction based on past data was perfect, but the sources state one single random event and he will be no more. The sheer probability of an event, even if incredibly low, doesn't matter nearly as much as the payoff or consequence if that rare event occurs. Being right 99.9% of the time means absolutely nothing if the 0.1% involves total ruin. You might be right 1,000 times, but if the one time you're wrong is catastrophic, it negates all previous successes.
This circles right back to concepts like the green lumber fallacy, which we just discussed, and the whole idea of black swan events. It's not about predicting the event better or computing probabilities more accurately. It's fundamentally about managing your exposure to its impact, reducing your fragility.
Yes, and the problem is deeply ingrained in our rationalistic thinking. When failures occur, especially large-scale ones, the typical response from predictors and experts is often, we need better computation, we need more data, we need to predict the event better and figure out the probabilities with more precision.
Yeah, refine the models.
Right. But the sources argue forcefully that the vastly more effective approach is to modify your exposure and learn to get out of trouble, to reduce your fragility, or even better, become anti-fragile to these unpredictable events. Focus on consequence mitigation, not just prediction accuracy. And this is something traditional and religious heuristics, which often contain centuries of accumulated non-verbalized wisdom about risk, have been remarkably good at enforcing through rules and customs. They inherently understood the asymmetric payoff, even if they couldn't articulate the probability in precise mathematical terms.
Okay, this brings us, I think, to the very heart of the discussion. The core mechanism behind fragility and anti-fragility. Nonlinearity. It's a concept the author apparently spent years in seclusion trying to understand and articulate, sensing its profound importance far beyond his initial field of finance.
Yes, he describes his deeply personal journey of discovery, starting back in the mid-1990s when he took a few years off, famously deposited his necktie in the trash as a symbol of abandoning the conventional Wall Street world, and went into seclusion. He literally locked himself in the attic trying to express what was coming out of my guts, specifically framing hidden nonlinearities and their effects. His big technical book, Dynamic Hedging, which focused on managing these tricky, nonlinear derivative exposures in finance, was born there.
So it started in finance.
It started there, but even then, he knew it had vastly more importance. He understood that these hidden dynamics, these nonlinearities, permeated all complex systems, biological, social, technological.
And it had a rather amusing, almost ironic start to its publication, didn't it? A prime example of that academic practitioner divide he often critiques.
Amusingly so, yes. It was mistakenly submitted for 4 referees, all of whom were academic financial economists, rather than the quantitative finance experts, the practitioners, who would have understood its practical implications and the math behind it. All 4 academics rejected my book, interestingly, for the 4 sets of completely different reasons, with absolute no intersection in their arguments.
Wow. All rejected, but for different reasons.
Exactly. The author Riley noted that if he had truly been wrong in his analysis, they likely would have had the exact same reason for rejection. It perfectly illustrates that gap between abstract theoretical understanding, where professors can fundamentally disagree on core concepts, and the practical, tangible understanding held by practitioners who deal with real-world consequences and need tools that actually work.
It sounds like a deeply personal quest for him, spanning years and even cycles of his public life. The sources mention that after the financial crisis of the late 2000s, a period where many of his predictions about hidden risks dramatically played out, he went through an episode of hell from public life, feeling de-intellectualized and corrupted by the demands and misinterpretations. He then returned to intense seclusion where he had this profound revelation about a simple porcelain cup.
Indeed. It sounds mundane, but it was crucial. He realized, looking at that everyday object, that the porcelain cup did not like volatility or variability or action. It just wanted calm and to be left alone. This led to a key insight. Fragility was simply vulnerability to the volatility of things that affected it. It was a simple yet groundbreaking realization that allowed him to extend his mathematical work on complex derivatives to everyday objects, biological systems, and complex societal structures. Anything that doesn't like variation, randomness, stress that thing is fragile.
So let's get right to it. What is nonlinearity in simple terms? How does it manifest in the real world, and why is it so absolutely crucial to understanding fragility and antifragility?
Okay. In essence, nonlinearity means the response to a change is not a straight line. Simple as that. If you double the dose or the input, the stress, the force, whatever it is, you don't necessarily get double the effect. You might get a lot more or a lot less. It's about compounding effects, thresholds, tipping points, and disproportionate returns or damages.
Not just 1 + 1 = 2.
Exactly. Sometimes 1 + 1 = 0, sometimes 1 + 1 + 10. The sources illustrate this beautifully with a story from rabbinical literature, The King and His Son, which apparently originates from the early Near East and conveys this ancient wisdom about unintended consequences and scale.
How does that story work to explain nonlinearity and the disproportionate impact of large shocks versus small ones?
Furious with his son, swore a solemn oath to crush him with a large stone. Big trouble. After calming down, though, he faced a moral dilemma. A king cannot break his oath, but he also didn't want to kill his own son. What to do?
Sticky situation.
Very. His sage advisor's solution was brilliant. Cut the large stone into very small pebbles and have the son pelted with them. The king fulfilled his oath technically, but without killing his son. The profound point here is the difference between 1,000 pebbles and a large stone of equivalent weight perfectly illustrates how fragility stems from nonlinear effects. A single large shock is disproportionately more harmful than many small ones, even if their total weight or cumulative energy is exactly the same. The harm isn't simply additive, it compounds exponentially with scale.
So how do we detect if something is fragile? Using this principle of nonlinearity, is there a simple rule, a sort of test we can apply when looking at systems?
Yes, there's a very simple rule. A diagnostic test. For the fragile, shocks bring harm, higher harm, as the intensity increases. If you were to graph the harm on the vertical axis and the intensity of the shock or stressor on the horizontal axis, the harm curves inward with a steeper and steeper vertical slope. What mathematicians call a concave curve.
Concave, like curving inwards, like a frown.
Exactly like a frown. It means every additional unit of intensity causes increasingly more damage. Think of it this way. The more you stress something fragile, the faster it breaks or degrades. The marginal damage increases with each increment of stress. It accelerates towards failure.
Give us some concrete, real-world examples of this concavity from the sources. It really helps to visualize it beyond graphs and mathematical terms.
Okay, take a car. Driving it into a wall at 50 miles per hour causes way more damage than if you drove it in the same wall 10 times at 5 miles per hour. The harm isn't linear. The impact at higher speed is disproportionately destructive. Double the speed, much more than double the damage. Or consider alcohol consumption. Drinking 7 bottles of wine in one setting is more harmful than drinking 1 bottle of wine a day for 7 days. Same total amount, vastly different impact. Why? Because every additional glass of wine harms you more than the preceding one. Your body's ability to process it diminishes, and the toxicity compounds non-linearly.
Okay, that makes sense.
The same with that porcelain cup. Dropping it from 1 foot is worse than 12 times the damage from a drop from a height of 1 inch. Or jumping from 30 feet brings more than 10 times the harm of jumping from the height of 3 feet, and is in fact often fatal, unlike many small jumps that cause essentially no harm at all. The point is, the penalty or the damage gets exponentially worse, not linearly. A small increase in stress, especially beyond a certain point, leads to a much, much larger increase in negative impact. That's concavity, that's fragility.
And the sources link this directly to extreme events.
Yes, they explain that something fragile is both unbroken and subject to nonlinear effects and extreme rare events. Because impacts of large size are rarer than the one smaller size, we often adapt to or ignore the cumulative effect of small deviations, small bumps in the road. We're immune to the cumulative effect of small deviations, but we are disproportionately hurt by large, infrequent ones. The fragile is hurt a lot more by extreme events than by a succession of intermediate ones. It's these black swan events, the rare, high-impact, unpredictable ones, that truly break the fragile system because of this concave response.
So what about anti-fragility then? How does nonlinearity work there? Does it just flip the curve? Is it convex?
Precisely, you've got it. We flip the argument entirely. For the antifragile, shock brings more benefits as the intensity increases, up to a point, of course. The benefits curve outwards, like a smile or a capital U lying on its side, what we call a convex curve.
Convex, like curving outwards, like a smile.
Got it. The weightlifter analogy is perfect here, building on our earlier discussion. Lifting 100 pounds once brings more benefits than lifting 50 pounds twice, and certainly a lot more than lifting 1 pound 100 times. Every additional pound of weight, up to the point of failure, brings more benefit to the body's strength adaptation than the preceding one did. The system doesn't just get stronger proportionally, it gets stronger disproportionately. The marginal benefit increases with each increment of stress. That's convexity, that's anti-fragility.
So convexity is good because it implies increasing returns from stress and volatility, and concavity is bad because it implies accelerating harm.
Oh.
And the sources suggest this principle applies to literally everything. That's a huge claim, almost a universal law of systems.
The sources are quite emphatic about its universality, saying this framework affects just anything in sight, even medical error, government size, innovation, anything that touches uncertainty. The principle is fundamental. If you have more upside than downside from variations, from stressors, from unexpected events, the curve of your outcome will be convex, making you anti-fragile. If you have more downside than upside from the same variations, it will be concave, making you fragile. It's a fundamental property that reveals hidden dynamics in seemingly disparate fields, a lens to see the world through.
Okay, let's apply this to some everyday systems that we might not intuitively think of as nonlinear, but probably are. New York City traffic, for example. I deal with that all the time, and it definitely feels like it's fragile to stress. Like one accident can cause gridlock for hours.
Oh, traffic is a classic example. It's highly nonlinear. Initially, adding more cars to a highway has minimal impact, right? You can add quite a few cars with no noticeable change in travel time. Flow remains smooth.
Yeah, up to a point.
Exactly. But beyond a certain critical point, a density threshold, a 10% increase in cars can make travel time jump by 50% or even more. This means travel cost, or travel time, is fragile to the volatility of the number of cars on the highway. This is a classic concave response, where the negative impact accelerates dramatically after a certain threshold is crossed. The system becomes exponentially less efficient as it approaches capacity. Tiny changes cause massive delays.
The sources describe a specific incident where New York City officials allowed filming on the 59th Street Bridge, blocking part of it, assuming it would be no big deal on a Saturday. They clearly didn't get the memo about nonlinearity, did they?
Not at all. It's a perfect case study. A small traffic problem turned into mayhem only owing to multiplicative effects. What they expected to be a few minutes delays was multiplied by 2 orders of magnitude. Minutes became hours. Total gridlock. Why? Because the authorities did not understand nonlinearities. This, the sources argue, is the central problem of efficiency in over-optimized systems that are stretched to their absolute limits with minimal redundancy or slack. They optimize for average conditions, for predictable flow, not for rare, extreme, or compounding stresses. They become incredibly fragile.
And it's not just traffic or physical systems. Central banks, too, operating at a macro level, seem to exhibit similar nonlinear behaviors that policymakers often miss when relying on overly simplistic linear models.
Indeed. The sources point out that central banks can print money with no effect for a long time, lulling policymakers into believing their actions are perfectly linear and predictable. But then, seemingly, unexpectedly printing causes a jump in inflation or a dramatic, unpredictable shift in market behavior. Many economic results, the sources lament, are completely canceled by convexity effects because policymakers' tools and models are based on the overly linear, ignoring these hidden compounding impacts and feedback loops. They might call it approximation, but it's often a fundamental failure to grasp the underlying physics of the complex economic system they're trying to manage.
What about the idea that more is different? That larger entities or systems are inherently more fragile, not necessarily more robust or efficient, despite what conventional wisdom might suggest about economies of scale. Does nonlinearity support that?
The sources strongly support this, yes. If you double the exposure to something, like size or debt, and it causes more than double the harm when things go wrong, that's the very definition of fragility of negative nonlinearity. This applies powerfully to corporate mergers, which often do not appear to play out successfully, despite theories of economies of scale suggesting they should be more efficient and resilient.
Right, mergers often fail.
Very often. Richard Roll's hubris hypothesis back in 1978 already noted that companies irrationally engage in mergers given their historically poor track record of actually creating value, a trend that continues to this day. Size, beyond a certain point, often conceals hidden, disproportionate risks in complex systems. Larger entities have longer, more complex chains of dependencies, making them much more susceptible to cascading failures when one part breaks.
And it's true for animals too, right? We touched on this. But the very large ones are often the most vulnerable to environmental shocks or changes.
Yes, absolutely. The sources explain that large animals, such as elephants, woolly mammoths, tend to become rapidly extinct during periods of environmental stress because they are inherently more fragile to shocks than the small ones. Jared Diamond's famous paper, Why Cats Have 9 Lives, perfectly illustrates this principle with physics. Cats and mice can survive falls from several times their height due to their smaller mass, higher surface area to volume ratio, and different biomechanics, while elephants break limbs very easily from even relatively minor falls. Smaller entities often have a built-in robustness, a natural anti-fragility, because smaller shocks don't scale up to create large system-breaking impacts in the same way.
But nonlinearity can also be incredibly beneficial, right? We talked about weightlifting. What about nutrition? Does it challenge our conventional understanding of balanced diets, suggesting that variability might actually be a hidden ingredient for health?
Absolutely. This is where the anti-fragile aspects, the convexity, truly shine and offer practical insights. Health authorities often recommend set quantities of nutrients every day with balanced composition and metronymic regularity. Eat exactly this much protein, this much carb every single day.
The standard advice.
The standard advice. This approach, however, completely misses a hidden dimension that is variability. They're optimized for linearity, assuming steady intake is best, missing the potential benefits of fluctuation, the convexity that ancestral practices often intuitively understood and incorporated.
So, like intermittent fasting or periods of feasting, consuming nutrients unevenly rather than strictly regimented might actually be beneficial for our systems.
Precisely. The sources suggest that consuming, say, no proteins at all on Monday and catching up on Wednesday seemingly causes a different, better physiological response, possibly because the deprivation as a stressor activates some pathways that facilitate subsequent absorption, repair, and adaptation. This convexity has been totally missed by science, though not by religions and ancestral heuristics and traditions that often incorporated periods of fasting or feasting. It's an ancient wisdom, perhaps, reflecting our evolutionary past, that modern science is only now starting to rediscover, recognizing that mild, acute stressors, including dietary ones, can prime the system for greater benefit and resilience.
So traditional practices might hold profound wisdom that science is just catching up to, precisely because they've been tested and refined by the stresses of history, not designed in a lab. And the same applies to exercise, I imagine. It's not just about constant moderate effort, but maybe bursts of intensity.
Yes, exactly. The sources explain that health benefits are convex to speed and intensity. They give the compelling example of two brothers, Castor, who walks a mile steadily at a consistent, moderate pace, and Polydeuces, who plays around, maybe rests, then sprints the same mile, finishing in the same total time. Polydeuces, the one who experienced high-intensity bursts followed by rest, gains significantly more health benefits.
More bang for his buck, essentially.
Or bang for his buck, exactly. Exercise itself, the sources argue, is fundamentally an exploitation of convexity effects. Small, intense, acute stresses, followed by adequate recovery, make us stronger, not just linearly, but disproportionately. The body overcompensates, adapts, and grows beyond the sum of the individual stressors. That's leveraging nonlinearity for positive gain.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the squeeze effect, which sounds quite painful and seems to highlight the extreme vulnerability of fragile systems when faced with sudden constraints.
Yes, a squeeze occurs when people have no choice but to do something and to do it right away, regardless of its costs. You lose your optionality completely. The sources use the vivid example of an unexpected flight cancellation for a crucial family event, say at London Heathrow Airport. Because of Heathrow's notorious fragility to disruptions, its over-optimization, lack of redundancy, tight scheduling, you might be forced to pay 10 times the price for a last-minute ticket to another airport or on another airline because you absolutely have to get there.
They're trapped.
You're trapped, you have no options, and the price skyrockets non-linearly. Your optionality has been removed, and you are squeezed by the fragile system.
And size makes you even more vulnerable to these squeezes, doesn't it? Larger entities, or those with larger needs, feel the pain of a squeeze much more acutely.
Exactly. Owning an elephant as a pet, for instance, as the source humorously suggests, makes you incredibly vulnerable during a water shortage, forcing you to pay higher and higher price for each additional gallon of water because you have no other choice. The elephant needs to drink huge amounts. Size hurts you at times of stress. It's a negative convexity effect, where the unexpected cost as a percentage of the total would be monstrous compared to owning a smaller, less demanding pet like a cat, which would require far less water in the same shortage.
Makes sense.
Large corporations also experience this intensely. The visible gains from size and scale are often celebrated, but the hidden disproportionate risks in times of stress, when they're squeezed by external events like supply chain disruptions or sudden changes in demand, are often ignored or underestimated until it's too late. They might seem too big to fail, but often they are also too big, too rigid to be agile and avoid the squeeze.
Okay, to wrap up this fascinating deep dive, our sources deliver a powerful and maybe somewhat provocative critique of modern education, particularly higher education. It seems Taleb sees it as a potentially fragile institution, maybe ripe for a reckoning, precisely because of some of the principles we've discussed.
Yes, the author is quite direct, almost scathing at times. He describes prestigious institutions like Ivy League universities as becoming primarily a status, luxury good, something akin to a Louis Vuitton bag or a Cartier watch, particularly for the new Asian and U.S. upper class. It's about signaling status, not necessarily about acquiring deep, useful knowledge.
A Veblen good, almost.
Exactly. And this creates a huge drag on the middle-class parent who have been plowing an increased share of their savings into these institutions, often at great personal sacrifice and at the expense of other potentially more beneficial investments or experiences, like starting a business or traveling.
And the student loan system is singled out, too, as a fundamental part of this problem, creating a massive cycle of debt that fuels the system.
Yes, it's called no different from racketeering in the sources, a very strong term. The argument is that it automatically transferred vast sums of money to rent extractors, people benefiting from the system without adding proportional value like administrators, real estate developers building fancy dorms, and sometimes tenured professors, rather than genuinely benefiting the students in a way that justifies the cost.
Ouch.
It's provocative. The sources go so far as to question whether collectively society doesn't appear to advance with organized education as much as is widely assumed. The perceived benefits and the idea of linear progression often don't match the actual systemic outcomes or the crippling long-term debt burden on individuals.
So despite its perceived benefits and central role in society, the formal structured education system itself might be inherently fragile, precisely because it lacks crucial optionality and has been largely shielded from real-world stresses and consequences.
Precisely. That's the core argument. The sources describe formal, organized research and the Soviet Harvard idea, the centralized, top-down, overly planned approach to knowledge production and academic structures, as systems that do not use optionality or later or second-order effects. They don't embrace randomness, serendipity, or allow for individual, nonlinear exploration easily.
They're too rigid.
Too rigid, too planned. This fundamental absence of optionality, of benefiting from unexpected variation, invalidates their view about the role of teleological science, the idea that science progresses neatly towards a predetermined goal or technology's history, which is full of accidental discoveries. These educational systems often operate under an overly linear, predictable model, which makes them highly susceptible to nonlinear disruptions and renders them fragile when faced with real-world uncertainty and change. They are built for a predictable mediocrity, but we live increasingly, in an unpredictable extremist stand.
But the author isn't entirely pessimistic about education's future, is he? It sounds like there's a strange kind of optimism there, almost derived from its very fragility. How does that work?
No, surprisingly, he expresses optimism, but it's a unique kind. He's optimistic about education's future precisely because of its current perceived fragility. He poses a rhetorical question. Which scam in history has lasted forever?
Implying it won't last.
Implying that unsustainable systems eventually collapse. He has enormous faith in time and history as eventual debunkers of fragility. Since education, in its current overstructured, overfinancialized form, is described as an institution that has been growing without external stresses, meaning it hasn't truly had to adapt to real-world pressures because of its protected status and government subsidies, it implies that things break predictably. Systems that don't face stressors don't get stronger, they get brittle. Ultimately, he believes, time is an eraser rather than a builder for such fragile, non-adapting systems. This suggests an inevitable reckoning for overly structured, non-optional systems that haven't faced sufficient stressors to adapt and become anti-fragile. So there's hope, but it's hope in the eventual collapse or radical transformation of unsustainable, fragile structures, paving the way for something more robust, more adaptive, maybe more decentralized.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you navigate your own life and the world around you? We've taken a really deep dive into Anti-Fragile, exploring everything from the strategic barbell approach to that ancient clash between Fat Tony and Socrates. We've understood that payoff often trumps probability, and seen how the hidden force of nonlinearity shapes our world, making some things fragile and others anti-fragile.
Yeah, this deep dive really encourages you to look beyond superficial appearances and overly neat linear explanations. It's about recognizing that the most severe mistake made in life is to mistake the unintelligible for the unintelligent, and that knowing what happens to you is always the most important thing, not the event in itself. It's about consequences. By truly understanding fragility and anti-fragility, you can begin to identify where you might be unknowingly exposed to hidden risks, and, more importantly, how to make more robust decisions in your own life, perhaps even moving towards a position where you can benefit from uncertainty from the inevitable shocks.
The next time you face a significant choice or encounter a system that seems to be running maybe too efficiently with absolutely no room for error, no slack, ask yourself, is this an opportunity for anti-fragility where I can potentially gain disproportionately from uncertainty and chaos by taking a calculated risk? Or am I walking into a squeeze where a small disruption could have catastrophic nonlinear costs, turning a minor issue into a monumental problem because the system is just too brittle?
And perhaps the most provocative thought for you to mull over after this deep dive, something to really chew on. If life truly is not a puzzle to be solved, but a mystery to be lived, as Fat Tony suggests, how much of what we can't easily define or perfectly rationalize, our intuitions, our gut feelings, our traditions, our tacit knowledge gained through experience, how much of that might actually be the hidden source of our strength and resilience? Is there indeed a realm of wisdom from which the logician is exiled that you're currently overlooking, just waiting to be rediscovered and embraced in your own life?